Fazbear Entertainment, the company behind the many restaurants and characters we've grown to know and love, but a number of mysterious and horrific incidents plagued what should have been a genuine and successful history of children's entertainment. Let's read between the lines of the story we're told to find out what really happened throughout Fazbear Entertainment's hidden history of misfortune. In order to go in order chronologically, we'll be looking at the games backwards, starting with FNAF 4 and ending with FNAF 1. I'm also going to try my best to make it explicitly clear when I'm directly reading from the game story versus when I'm theorizing, so that nothing is taken out of context. With that understood, let's uncover the truth behind Fazbear Entertainment's mysterious history. The original restaurant, Fredbear's Family Diner, was the first of many ventures into children's entertainment attempted by Fazbear Entertainment and its founders, Henry, Emily, and William Afton. Most of what we know about this location comes from FNAF 4's Minigames, with some information also coming from the original novel trilogy and other games. Fredbear's Family Diner most likely opened in the late 70s. According to the novel trilogy, the year was 1979. Whether or not that is true to the game's continuity, we at least know that it was open for business in 1983, as shown in FNAF 4's Minigames and made evident by an Easter egg in which a television show named Fredbear and Friends is dated 1983. Some people believe that this Easter egg confirms that the original animatronics started in Fredbear's alongside the classic animatronics, but I'll get into that a little bit later. Anyways, these original animatronics are nowhere to be seen in this diner. The two we do see are Fredbear and Bonnie, in both animatronic and costume forms. Presumably, these are designated animatronics and these are Springlock suits, but I'm not entirely sure. In the Silver Eyes, we see William and Henry on stage in their mascot suits, but the employees in this restaurant seem to be staying on the floor. At this time, there was also most likely a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza open. This would explain the Fredbear and Friends Easter egg and all of the toys seen throughout the minigame. Now, I am 100% convinced that Dream Theory was canon at one point, and that most of the details of this minigame were meant to corroborate that idea. However, whether or not that was true at one point, with the information we have from later games, it's been disproven. That means that, in my eyes, some of the evidence in this game may now be negligible. For example, this kid has a green Spring Bonnie plush that he calls a finger trap. This is a pretty obvious reference to Springtrap, a green decayed version of Spring Bonnie that this game predates by about 40 years. Without Dream Theory being true, I can't possibly think of what this would mean for the lore. There's really no reason for a green version of Spring Bonnie to ever exist circa Fazbear's Fright. With that being said, I'm going to do my best to decide what information is still relevant and how it fits into the story when applicable. Most of the toys, excluding Green Bonnie, most likely reference Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The toys, those being the toys of the FNAF 2 toy animatronics, could have been the inspiration for their look in FNAF 2. As for Fredbear and Friends, I see two possibilities that are equally negligent to the narrative. One, that the story is simply fictional and doesn't depict any real restaurant or event, or two, it is a way for Fazbear Entertainment to introduce the new characters into the franchise. Since Fredbear was already popular at the time, this show could have been a way to usher the new characters in while promoting the new restaurant, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, that we know opened in 1983. One of the most memorable events in the timeline is the Bite of 83, most likely the incident that got Fredbear's Family Diner closed. Now, I don't think that this tragedy was caused by a Springlock failure, which I'll explain later, but rather that it was simply the negligence of one of the diner's customers, Foxy Bro. Foxy Bro, who is believed to be Michael Afton, is depicted as a bully all throughout this minigames. On the final night, Foxy Bro picks up the crying child knowing that he's afraid of animatronics and brings him as close as he can get to Fredbear as he sings on stage. Eventually, Fredbear bites down and fatally wounds the child, who is told by his dad, William Afton, that he will be put back together. While this statement is pretty ambiguous, most people believe that William is promising to bring his son back to life, whether it be through crude experimentation or unnatural practice. Anyway, as far as Fazbear Entertainment is concerned, his death was a major inconvenience. Even though this incident directly affected one of the company's founders, Fazbear Entertainment buried it and built over it. Metaphorically, I mean they covered it up. Now, one of the earliest events in the timeline is Charlotte Emily's death, better known as Charlie. In the novel trilogy, Charlie dies at Fredbear's Family Diner in 1983, which lines up pretty well with the common narrative, but I have a deviant theory. First, in the spirit of discrediting that the books parallel the games in terms of this event, Charlie dies at only 3 years old in the Silver Eyes. I think most people would agree that these two characters do not depict the same age. Now, that's obviously not the strongest piece of evidence, so let's take a look into the other reasons why I don't think Charlie died at Fredbear's. In the minigame Take Cake to the Children, or Save Him, we see Charlie's death for the first time. Now, the words save him are spelled out during this minigame minigame, referring to the sad child who we later find out is Charlie Emily, so we know that this character's gender was later retconned. Anyway, in this minigame, we see Freddy serving pizza, something that is never referenced to have happened at Fredbear's Diner. I'm gonna go in depth on this later, but I don't believe the original animatronics were ever present at Fredbear's. In a later minigame from Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator titled Security Puppet, we essentially see the same event but in greater detail. This time, Freddy is not shown, but the puppet is inside amongst the kids. Now we know FNAF 2's location was only open for a few short weeks, as stated in the newspaper after the restaurant closed, but I believe that the game is set during only its second week open. This is because Phone Guy specifically says that we're only the second guard to work here, and that the first guy finished up his week and then switched to the day shift.
You're only the second guard to work at that location. The first guy finished his week, but we switched him over to the day shift.
Assuming that guard started working the first week of the restaurant being open, and that Jeremy Fitzgerald started working immediately after he was moved to the day shift, that would make the restaurant only 2 weeks old. We also know that Phone Guy has opinions about the puppet, saying that he never liked it, whereas he never really speaks from experience with the new toy animatronics.
That glitch might have carried over to the newer models too. I'll be honest, I never liked that puppet thing.
This, combined with the fact that he seems to have a limited understanding of Fredbear's Family Diner, makes me think that the puppet was around before FNAF 2, and since Phone Guy probably wasn't at Fredbear's Family Diner, the puppet would have had to have been from the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. That lines up perfectly with both instances of Charlie's death, one showing Freddy and one showing the puppet, two animatronics who I believe started at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Further evidence is the fact that Freddy's Sprite and Take Cake to the Children has 2 buttons, like his withered form. We know that the withered animatronics came from the previous location.
The older models, those are from the previous location, and we just use them for parts now.
And since they became withered around the time of FNAF 2, Freddy would have only looked like this at the first Freddy's restaurant. Since both of these restaurants were most likely open at the same time at one point, this still fits the common narrative, with just a minor detail change. There's also mention to the crying child having seen something that caused him to fear the animatronics. It is possible that what he saw was Charlie Emily's death, even though I believe it would have taken place at a different restaurant than the one he frequents, but there are very many theories as to what he saw. It could be as simple as him seeing an employee get into a suit, which he believes to be an act of violence as referenced later in the minigames, or it could have been Elizabeth's death, if you believe that Circus Baby's Pizza World was open this early in the timeline. Since we don't have a lot of evidence as to what this event was, I'm gonna leave it up in the air for now, with a couple of possible solutions that you guys can decide about. The first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was opened in 1983, as we know from the Faz tokens, which tell us that the restaurant has been around since '83. This restaurant was significantly different from the restaurants we see in FNAF 1 and 2. For one, it employed performers/entertainers who wore mascot costumes.
Welcome to your new career as a performer/entertainer for Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. These tapes will provide you with much needed information on how to handle/climb into/climb out of mascot costumes.
In FNAF 3, Phone Dude digs up a handful of vintage training cassettes presumably from the first restaurant, as the technology is more primitive and there is little mention of the tragedies that we hear about in the tapes from the other restaurants. In these tapes, Phone Guy tells us that the restaurant currently uses 2 specially designed suits that double as both animatronic and suit, most likely Fredbear and Spring Bonnie.
Right now we have 2 specially designed suits that double as both animatronic and suit.
A lot of people think that the classic animatronics originated at Fredbear's Family Diner, simply because of an Easter egg in FNAF 4 showing a TV show from 1983 named Fredbear and Friends, in which Fredbear is singing alongside the original animatronics, but there is no evidence that these animatronics started at Fredbear's. From what Phone Guy implies, it's far more likely that the original animatronics first appeared at the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, where Fredbear also featured. Being a new franchise, it makes sense that Fazbear Entertainment would have the already popular Fredbear accompany the new characters in their new restaurant, and the TV show would promote these new characters as friends of Fredbear. When explaining how to use these specially designed suits, Phone Guy emphasizes the importance of knowing how to operate them, adding that incidents involving irreparable and grotesque maiming can occur, as well as death. He tells us when in animatronic mode, the characters are programmed to walk towards sounds, which explains Springtrap's mechanics and seems to confirm that Spring Bonnie is one of the 2 suits he's referencing in these tapes. We learn how to convert the animatronic into suit mode by inserting a hand crank into the suit and turning it. This recoils and compresses the animatronic parts to the sides of the suit, allowing a person to fit inside. Phone Guy stresses the importance of making sure the spring locks are fastened tight to ensure the animatronic parts remain fixed, as we later find out that this equipment is extremely temperamental. This is also the first time the word spring lock was used in the games.
Please make sure that spring locks are fastened tight to ensure the animatronic devices remain fixed.
In the next message, we learn that nudging, touching, and breathing on the spring locks inside of the suit is not recommended, as movement and moisture could cause the spring locks to come loose. In the event that this happens, we are told to maneuver away from populated areas before bleeding out, to protect the customer experience. With this protocol in place, it sounds like Fazbear Entertainment has either experienced an incident like this before, or are at least well aware of the potential danger. Now, according to the Silver Eyes, Henry Emily designed the early animatronics, including these spring lock suits, so it's interesting to hear the company glorify them so much considering how dangerous they are. From what Charlie tells us in the books, Henry wouldn't save anything that didn't work. He dismantled them for parts, and we know that Henry is a protagonist, unlike William Afton, who would be much more keen to put his employees in harm's way. This could be the company using Henry's technology irresponsibly, since we can assume that Henry wouldn't want anyone to be in danger of losing their life over a children's birthday party. We also hear mention of a designated safe room that every location is built with, and that it is hidden to customers and not included in the digital map programmed into the animatronics and security systems. This sort of retcons safe rooms into the restaurants from the previous games, as they wouldn't have been shown on our maps but are apparently featured in every location, although based on what we hear later, they might have done away with safe rooms altogether before the next restaurants opened. On the third call, we are briefed on a change of company policy. The springlock suits are no longer to be used. After an incident at the sister location involving multiple and simultaneous springlock failures, the company has deemed the suits temporarily unfit for employees. Phone Guy says that safety is top priority at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, which is why the classic suits are being retired to an appropriate location while being looked at by our technicians. If safety was the top priority, the restaurant wouldn't have been using the suits that are prone to fatally wounding their occupants if they breathe in the wrong direction. It's also worth considering that the suits are being retired and looked at by technicians. It isn't said exactly where the suits would be retired to, either a separate location like Fredbear's or maybe just a back room in the current restaurant. A line in the next recording seems to insinuate that the suits were moved to somewhere in the same restaurant.
Management has also been made aware that the Spring Bonnie animatronic has been noticeably moved.
We do know that Spring Bonnie at least is still around, since it's later used in the second location. It's also worth noting that Phone Guy says the suits are temporarily unfit for employees, which is him downplaying the situation by implying that they'll be fixed and recommissioned in the near future. We'll see a lot of this behavior in the next games too. Now about the incident that caused the suits to be retired. Phone Guy tells us that there was an incident at the sister location that involved multiple and simultaneous springlock failures. He seems to imply that there was only one sister location at the time, which would have to have been Fredbear's Family Diner, a restaurant we know was opened in 1983 and that was using springlock suits regularly.
After learning of an unfortunate incident at the sister location involving multiple and simultaneous springlock failures, the company has deemed the suits temporarily unfit for employees. The classic suits are being retired to an appropriate location while being looked at by our technicians.
It is possible that the bite of 83 is the incident described here, but technically the bite should have had nothing to do with springlock failure. Since Fredbear was singing in suit mode, his springlocks wouldn't have been compressed to where they could have snapped shut. So what was this springlock incident? Most likely this incident has never been shown or described further in any of the games, but it is interesting to note that in FNAF 4's Minigames, which likely show Fredbear's Family Diner in 1983, springlock suits can be seen in use up until Night 3. After Night 2, springlock suits are no longer seen in use, but can be seen disassembled in a storage room on Night 4, possibly hinting that the policy change had just occurred. If this is the case, Fredbear's Family Diner would have to have been the location of the springlock failure, which would have occurred days before the bite of 83. In the Silver Eyes, William Afton survives a springlock incident but endured horrible scars because of it. It's possible that the incident in the games was something like this. Even though Fazbear Entertainment's policies regarding the use of springlock suits were pretty lackadaisical considering their acknowledgement of potential dangers, if one of the company's owners had nearly died in one of the suits, it would make sense that they would draw the line. We learn that until replacements arrive, the employees are expected to wear temporary costumes that were found on very short notice and are probably not appropriate or relevant to the restaurant. Phone Guy stresses that the classic suits are not to be touched, activated, or worn under any circumstances. In the next recording, we are reminded that the safe rooms are reserved for equipment and such that is not currently being used, and that employees should not use it as a place to hide or congregate. We are also told that under no circumstance should a customer ever be taken into this room, and and out of the main show area. Phone Guy mentions that Spring Bonnie has been noticeably moved since his last message, and he reiterates that it is not safe to wear that costume. This seems to imply that all of the decommissioned Springlock suits were moved into their respective safe rooms in the restaurant they belong to. This one recording seems to connect all of the end of night minigames, recordings, and phone dude lines together in a way that explains the story of FNAF 3. Phone Guy stresses that the safe rooms are not a place for employees to hide or congregate, which is exactly what the purple guy, an employee, does in the end of night minigames. Phone Guy also emphasizes that a customer should never be taken out of the main show area and into this room, which is exactly how the first MCI is described by the newspapers in FNAF 1. The only detail that I'm missing is the mention of Fredbear's suit being moved. Let's assume the MCI happened shortly before the events of Follow Me, since we know that Spring Bonnie's suit was used after being banned in restaurant use and that customers were most likely brought into the safe room, since Phone Guy brings it up. During Follow Me, Shadow Freddy lures the original animatronics to the safe room, where they can't enter because it's not programmed into their digital maps. Once there, William, who had been hiding there, runs out and disassembles the animatronics. I just posted a full theory on this if you're interested. Check it out after this video. It'll be linked in the outro. The final message tells us that due to budget restrictions, the safe rooms are being sealed at most locations, which we can only assume to be Freddy's and Fredbear's. A false wall was put over the old door, leaving everything inside the room there, and we hear a request not to mention the safe rooms to family, friends, or insurance representatives. We know that William died behind this wall and was left to rot for at least 30 years. It can also be assumed that Fazbear Entertainment was very aware of this fact, hence the irrational decision to seal the safe rooms in response to a budget deficit. Furthermore, Phone Guy tells us not to tell anyone that this room even exists, most likely to protect their secret. The second Freddy Fazbear's Pizza opened in 1987 and was marketed as a grand reopening of the vintage pizzeria, this new location being the new and improved Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Interestingly, these phone calls seem to be live, as opposed to recordings like some of the other games. Reprising his role as narrator, the same phone guy from the previous location greets the player. He tells us that some people still have a negative impression of the company and that the old restaurant was left to rot for quite a while. This probably connects to what the FNAF 1 newspapers tell us, that after 5 children went missing, the company had been fighting an uphill battle for years trying to stay in business. Most likely due to the company's reputation being tarnished, this restaurant featured a new set of animatronics dedicated to safety, having facial recognition tied to a criminal database. They also featured advanced mobility features that allow them to walk around during the day. Phone Guy alludes to some kinks in their programming, mentioning that the previous night guard complained about his working conditions. According to him, the animatronics were never given a proper night mode, so when it gets quiet, they try to find where the people are. We also learn about a music box that only seems to affect one of the animatronics, and that it should be wound up every so often. The rest of the animatronics may consider night guards as endoskeletons and try to stuff them into his suit, and to prevent this, they should put on an empty Freddy mask. Now, as much as I'd like to say he's wrong, this is actually the most likely explanation for the animatronics' behavior. I do believe that the original animatronics are possessed by the victims of the MCI from the previous location, but these new animatronics haven't been around long enough to be possessed. Most likely their programming is flawed in the exact way that Phone Guy describes, or someone like William had tampered with them from day one to make them violent. On the next call, Phone Guy makes reference to the withered animatronics, calling them the older models, and he tells us that they're from the previous location, which is assumed to be the first Freddy's. We find out that the original plan was to repair them for this restaurant, and that they even began retrofitting them with new technology, but they were too ugly and smelled awful. Because of this, the company decided to make a new series of animatronics that was super kid-friendly. His words, not mine. We are told that the older models shouldn't be able to walk around, but they clearly do, hinting that these animatronics are indeed possessed at this point. This is backed by reference to their terrible smell, which we hear about in FNAF 1's newspapers, likening the animatronics to reanimated carcasses. Phone Guy mentions Foxy the Pirate and says that he always loved those old characters, which is referencing his long history with the company and foreshadows the next game, FNAF 3, when we find out that he also worked at the previous pizzeria. We hear Phone Guy say that Foxy was always a bit twitchy, which seems to allude to his spotty behavior at the previous restaurant, but we never hear exactly what this refers to. We know that Foxy is out of order in FNAF 1, so perhaps this simply means his programming was never as thorough as the others. We later hear that the company tried to remake Foxy because they thought the first one was too scary. In doing this, they made Toy Foxy, or Funtime Foxy, and put him in Kids Cove, where he was perpetually subject to the tactile curiosity of toddlers. Funtime Foxy was supposed to entertain kids in the same way as the other animatronics, but he eventually became a take apart and put back together attraction after the staff decided to stop repairing him after every shift. This is interesting because the restaurant was only open for a few short weeks, and they only had one other guard before us who only worked a single week, meaning that there might be a time discrepancy here. Either the restaurant was open without a night watchman for several weeks, or we have some questions to ask. Would the staff really give up putting Foxy back together after just 1 week? Anyways, they eventually did and began calling him the Mangle. By the way, Phone Guy refers to Mangle with male pronouns, despite his character later appearing in the UCN preset Ladies Night using a female's voice. My working theory is that the character Mangle is a male, but the spirit possessing him is female, like the puppet. The puppet, who is canonically a male animatronic, is possessed by Charlie Emily, a female, and thus uses a female voice in UCN. Also, if the toddlers were responsible for Funtime Foxy becoming a mess of parts like Phone Guy tells us, where did his extra head and hand come from? This is one of the reasons why I think that character models aren't the best source of lore when compared to dialogue and minigames. So later when I tell you that the Wither animatronics are the FNAF 1 animatronics, think back to this before telling me that they look a little different. We also learned that the older models would always get disoriented by bright lights, causing a system restart, which doesn't seem to be backed by the next game and is likely just a game mechanic. Phone Guy calls this a glitch that may have carried over to the newer models too. At the end of the Night 2 call, he stresses the importance of winding the music box and says that he never liked that puppet thing because it's always thinking and it can go anywhere. This is probably in reference to the fact that the puppet is already possessed, like the Wither animatronics, which we see in 2 of this game's minigames, Take Cake to the Children and Give Gifts Give Life. This may also indicate that the puppet is an animatronic from a previous restaurant, more specifically the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. This isn't explicitly said, but Phone Guy seems to imply that the puppet has been around longer than the toy animatronics and that he's had experience with it. Since we know that he worked at the previous Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and that he doesn't even really know the name of Fredbear's Family Diner, he most likely worked around the puppet at the previous pizzeria. It's also interesting that the puppet can't be fooled by the Freddy mask trick, possibly referencing the fact that it gave the spirits of the animatronics life, and since we see it staring into Freddy's eyes in the end of night hallucinations, it would know that the night guard is not the real Freddy. On the 3rd night, Phone Guy is immediately curious about Foxy. He asks if he appeared in the hallway, saying, "Probably not, I was just curious." Interestingly, he says, "Like I said, he was always my favorite," but he never actually said that. Before the call ends, Phone Guy attempts to ease our mind about rumors we may have heard recently, saying, "Whatever is going on out there, however tragic it may be, has nothing to do with our establishment, and our guard during the day has reported nothing unusual, and he's been on watch from opening till close." Now, I'm not really sure what he's referring to, but it's possible that it could be in relation to a missing children incident or even Charlie Emily's death. However unlikely, we know that Charlie's death has been retconned a bit already, with her gender going from male to female, so I suppose it's possible that this was originally in reference to that. This would explain the line, "Whatever is going on out there has nothing to do with our establishment." If whatever he's referring to happened inside of the restaurant, like an MCI, it would be hard to claim that it had nothing to do with the establishment, and he also says out there. We know that Charlie died in an alley outside of Freddy's, so it would make sense if that's what he's referring to. Of course, later in FNAF 6, it's implied that Charlie was William's first victim, so it would have had to have been later retconned. We also know that William has been known to lure children during the late hours of operation, and with Phone Guy mentioning the guard that's on watch from opening till close has reported nothing unusual, this could be what he's talking about. On the next night, we get a follow-up to the aforementioned rumors with mention of an ongoing investigation. Phone Guy mentions that they may end up having to close down for a few days as a precaution, even though Fazbear Entertainment denies any wrongdoing. He also says, "Just as a side note though, try to avoid eye contact with any of the animatronics tonight if you can. Someone may have tampered with their facial recognition systems, we're not sure." But the characters have been acting very unusual, almost aggressive towards the staff. We find out that for whatever reason they're fine around kids but stare when they encounter adults. The next night, the building is on lockdown. No one is allowed in or out, especially any previous employees. We are specifically told to keep a close eye on things tonight. Then we find out that a position mysteriously became available during the day and that we may have to cover that shift when the restaurant returns to normal. We're also told that they don't have a replacement for the night shift in the event that our character is moved to the day, which makes me think that having a night guard in the restaurant during business hours is a priority. Since the company no longer has someone working the day shift and is willing to leave the night shift unoccupied to fill that position, it seems like having a security guard during the day shift is extremely important. Based on what we know from the first MCI, and considering that William Afton is a previous employee, it's likely that the company is concerned about William luring children out of the restaurant during its late hours of operation. It's also possible that the animatronics are acting one characteristic, and this is why they need someone to work the day shift. We also hear that the company is planning to reach out to the original restaurant owner of Fredbear's Family Diner, a restaurant that has been closed down for years. Phone Guy says, "I doubt we'll be able to track anyone down." This owner is most likely Henry Emily, the face behind the original Fredbear mascot, but in the event that William is not the perpetrator referred to in the previous mentions, it could also be him. It is peculiar that Phone Guy first says the singular noun of restaurant owner before later saying, "I doubt we'll be able to track anyone down." The reason for this contact is also ambiguous. The company could be reaching out to see if any employees from that diner would be interested in a security guard position at the new restaurant, or perhaps Fazbear Entertainment is looking for someone to blame for everything that is going wrong. On the final night, we receive a distressing call from Phone Guy who is wondering why we're at the restaurant. He tells us that it is closed down for a while and alludes to someone using a spare suit as the cause of the shutdown. After that, none of the animatronics were acting right. Despite the restaurant apparently being closed down, we are told that there is one more event scheduled that we will have to be present for. We're told to wear our uniform, stay close to the animatronics, and make sure they don't hurt anyone. This confirms that Jeremy Fitzgerald is moving to the day shift, but still leaves the question of did they find a replacement for the night shift. We know that Fritz Smith eventually takes over, but technically this could have been anywhere from the following night to 2 weeks later. Jeremy receives his final check after night 6, dated November 13, whereas the notice of termination Fritz Smith received only gives a month, November. Since the restaurant announces its closure after Jeremy's last night shift, there's really no way to tell when Fritz takes over. Either way, he'd most likely be working in an abandoned building since Phone Guy mentions one last event and the newspapers say that the restaurant is closing its doors. Based on the instructions, wear your uniform, stay close to the animatronics, and make sure they don't hurt anyone, many people believe that this birthday party is where the bite of 87 occurred. We know that the animatronics were already acting aggressive towards staff, and after some incident involving a person wearing a yellow suit, they weren't acting right. Phone Guy specifically instructs Jeremy to make sure they don't hurt anyone, which could be insinuating that they had previously injured someone, but most likely it's just a precaution since the animatronics have been noticeably acting out of character. It seems pretty clear that the company knew the danger of continuing to use these animatronics, and even after mentioning that they might have to close for a few days, they refused to cancel this party, putting customers, children, and employees in danger. The last piece of information we get from Phone Guy is that he plans on taking the night shift when the restaurant opens again, which doesn't seem to happen until at least the following year, since the restaurant ends up permanently closing after only being open for a few short weeks. Due to their glitchy behavior, the new animatronics were scrapped, even though we later find out their parts are still around when we see them in a later game. The original characters, however, were purposely kept in hopes of a new restaurant opening someday. As for the guards, Jeremy Fitzgerald seemingly gets honorably laid off since the restaurant is closing, while Fritz Smith is scolded and fired after his first shift for tampering with the animatronics and odor. The lore significance of this is still up in the air, but many people believe that Fritz Smith is Michael Afton after the events of Sister Location, which would explain odor and could provide reason for him to be tampering with the animatronics. You'd think someone would have to be pretty confident in their ability to engineer animatronics to be tampering with the fuzzy Terminators that they are, so it begs the question, what the f is Fritz doing? The new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in FNAF 1 is described as a family pizzeria in the newspaper ad at the start of the game. This may mean that Fazbear Entertainment no longer owns the rights to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, or it could be an oversight with Scott being an independent game developer who didn't intend on making any follow-up games. For now, this information seems pretty unimportant. On his first night, Mike Schmidt starts his shift to a pre-recorded message from Freddy's most faithful employee, Phone Guy. What are they paying him? In this call, he directly tells us that the message is pre-recorded, and it likely takes place as recently as the previous week. This is implied because he mentions working in the office before us and that he's finishing up his last week. This is also assuming that the company had a replacement for him as soon as he announced his resignation and that we immediately precede him. We are read an introductory greeting from the company that Phone Guy mentions he's supposed to read, saying it's kind of a legal thing. This message begins by glorifying the restaurant and quickly shifts to a disclaimer that the company is not responsible for any damage to property or person or death. Throughout this disclaimer, Phone Guy does his best to make light of the topic, and given his history with the restaurant, he knows that these kind of things always happen. Despite this, he gaslights us by saying, "Now that may sound bad, I know, but there's really nothing to worry about." Well, of course, that's not true at all. There's plenty to worry about. What he should have said is, "Now that might sound bad, I know." Okay, good night. For instance, we're told that the animatronics get a bit quirky at night, and Phone Guy leaves absolutely nothing to the imagination when he later describes exactly what this means. He then says, "If I were forced to sing those same stupid songs for 20 years and I never got a bath, I'd probably be a bit irritable at night too." This not only tells us that he has a bad taste in music, but also tells us a lot about the history of the animatronics and Fazbear Entertainment. First, these animatronics have been around for 20 years, supposedly, and second, that they've never really had a cleaning. The former statement seems to confirm that these animatronics are the original ones from the first pizzeria, and by proxy, the withered animatronics from the second pizzeria. This is important because many people seem to think that these animatronics are completely different from the withered ones because they look different, but the facts are that the games, through Phone Guy and the newspapers, paint a different story. This is one of those times when we have to consider that Scott was an independent game developer who never intended to make any follow-up games, and so we have to decide which pieces of evidence are the most relevant. It is strange that Scott decided not to use the same game models from FNAF 1 and FNAF 2, but in the same game he tells us through the newspapers that the company plans to use the withered animatronics if they ever reorganize the company. So neglecting a design change, which could be explained by the technicians modifying the existing suits with slightly different parts, Scott directly tells us through the newspapers and phone recordings that these animatronics are the same. Now the latter, these animatronics haven't been cleaned since their creation. I'm not bringing this up for any real lore relevance, more so to further characterize Fazbear Entertainment. After years of their restaurants going up in flames, well not yet, and after Phone Guy explicitly alludes to their indescribable smell in the second game, Fazbear Entertainment still refuses to properly clean them. It is also likely that these animatronics have been possessed since the first pizzeria, possibly as early as 1983, a decade prior. As we know from the Silver Eyes, the spirit follows the flesh, meaning... Now, although this is what the games tell us and everything makes sense so far, there's one thing we have to consider. Phone Guy is full of shit. Remember how I just said that the animatronics could have been possessed 10 years ago when they first appeared? Well then how could they have been singing those same stupid songs for 20 years? Even the novel trilogy gave us the earliest date of 1979, being the year Fredbear's Family Diner opened, and there's really no evidence that the original animatronics were ever there. I'm not sure why Scott didn't just support this statement in the later games, but as far as we know, this line was probably retconned. He also says that the characters hold a special place in the hearts of children, which is very similar to a line from one of the newspaper articles in this game. These characters will live on. In the hearts of kids, these characters will live on. That article is most likely referring to the first location closing back in the 80s, and given that Phone Guy was there and speaks for the management throughout the recordings, it is possible that he may have even wrote this line. Now, that quote is from a CEO, but I'm just throwing it out there that the wording is pretty similar. We also know that Phone Guy basically says whatever the company tells him to a lot of the time, so maybe this is just a phrase they're using to make light of the awful things they've been involved in over the years.
So remember, these characters hold a special place in the hearts of children, and we need to show them a little respect.
We learn that the animatronics wander around at night because they're left in free roaming mode to keep their servos from locking up. But given the fact that they aren't even allowed to walk around during the day, why not just let them dance? Phone Guy tells us that after the bite of 87, most likely at the previous location, these animatronics aren't allowed to walk around during the day, so why let them walk around at night, especially considering what happens if they see the player? Assuming that their activity during the day is enough to keep their servos from freezing, why aren't they left dancing at night? Also, he tells us that they used to be able to walk around during the day before the bite of 87, which tells us that that incident, like the spring lock failure, permanently changed the company policy. We know that these animatronics weren't featured in the restaurant in FNAF 2, they were stored in the back, so this insinuates that the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza had their animatronics in free roam mode as well. We already knew that the spring lock suits at this location were programmed to stay where the children were, but there wasn't any mention of the original animatronics doing this until now. This is going to be good evidence for a future video I have planned when I discuss how the animatronics programming affects their behavior when possessed. Back to the bite of 87, we learn that the victim of this incident survived but lost their frontal lobe. In one of my FNAF movie theories, I drew a connection between this victim and Abby, whose odd behavior resembles that of someone without the use of their frontal lobe. In the game's continuity, many people believe this victim to be Jeremy Fitzgerald, who worked the final shift at the old 1987 pizzeria and was specifically told to stay close to the animatronics and make sure they don't hurt anyone. The bite of 87 is certainly one of the most mysterious events in FNAF. After being only briefly mentioned in the first game and sort of hinted at in the second game, we've really never heard anything further. It was even teased in the promotional pictures for FNAF 4, which ended up being an entirely different event that was resolved and fully fleshed out in one game, while we're still wondering what the bite of 87 means. After previously making light of the potential dangers of working here, Phone Guy doubles down by stating that the only risk that a night watchman faces is the fact that the animatronics would most likely consider them an endoskeleton if they're seen, and that they would be forcefully shoved into a Freddy Fazbear suit. At first, this doesn't sound so bad. A fuzzy mascot suit would surely be a comfortable place to be stuffed into. But then again, these are animatronics, not mascot suits. So the stuffy would have to maneuver crossbeams, wires, and other animatronic devices, especially the ones around head and height. Yeah, it would likely be more uncomfortable than cozy and fatal. When telling us that the animatronics would see us as an endoskeleton, Phone Guy says that's against the rules, which is interesting because there's an endoskeleton present every night in the backstage room. I'm not sure if that line was supposed to mean anything more than simply explaining why the player would be stuffed into a suit, but it is interesting how it seems to be immediately contradicted. He also says that in the event that we were stuffed into a suit, which he specifies would be a Freddy Fazbear suit, the only parts of us that would see the light of day again would be our eyeballs and teeth. This perfectly describes the game over screen, which shows a Freddy suit with 2 eyeballs popping out of the front of the mask. It is only shown after the animatronics jump scare the player. It's also interesting that the Freddy suit on the screen is in pretty much the exact same position and pose as the endo in the game, which is odd because the animatronics would consider us an endoskeleton, so that endo we see in the game wouldn't be used when we're stuffed. This is probably the point when us theorists have to take a step back and realize the genre we're in, meaning that some things in fiction probably require a level of dumb faith that goes beyond reality and practicality. I mean, you can pretty much see the endo inside of Freddy, so if the animatronics thought we were an endo, why would they be putting 2 endoskeletons into one suit? This could also be an instance of Phone Guy being naive and not realizing that the animatronics are possessed, so his explanation of their behavior may not at all be true to why they really do what they do. Since they were stuffed into animatronic suits, I guess it makes sense that they'd stuff someone else into a suit. Otherwise, why would they be programmed to build more animatronics? Wouldn't that put the technicians in jeopardy of having their jobs replaced? That'd be like me writing a program that writes more programs. And wouldn't it also break the illusion if they created another Freddy and he came out on stage with the other Freddy? Especially if he had human eyeballs hanging off of his face. Anyways, he also mentions the necessity of conserving power, which supports what we heard after the last restaurant closed, saying they're confident they'll reopen someday, even if it's with a much smaller budget. On the second night, Phone Guy says that he heard Freddy becomes more active in the dark. This not only tells us that there was another guard other than Phone Guy, but also that his theory really doesn't make much sense. If the animatronics were left in free roam mode to prevent their parts from stiffening up, why would Freddy move more in the absence of light? Most likely it's just a game mechanic without any lore relevance, but we always have to consider these things. On the third night, Phone Guy tells us that most people don't last this long, claiming that they move on to other things, not that they died. As skeptical as we have to be when listening to him, this statement is most likely true, but Phone Guy really fumbled that sentence.
I'm not implying that they died. That's not what I meant. Anyway,
based on the fact that he alludes to another guard before him, it's possible that Phone Guy had to cover that guard's shifts after he quit. Plus, his previous appearances in FNAF 2 and 3 paint him as some sort of higher up where he speaks from the company and enforces their policies. As far as we know, this could very well be his first time as a security guard. We also know from FNAF 2 that one of the guards there complained about conditions and was moved to the day shift. In this setting, we aren't sure if the restaurant is still open or not, so there may not have been a day shift to move to. Thus, discontent guards would be forced to move on to other things. Then Phone Guy tells us that he had an idea. If we get caught and want to avoid being stuffed into a Freddy suit, playing dead might make the animatronics consider us a costume rather than an endoskeleton, which would make them stuff an endoskeleton into us. Why are these animatronics so fixated on general maintenance? On night 4, Phone Guy calmly tells us that he might not be around to send a message the next day, claiming it's been a bad night for him. He asks us to check inside the suits in the back room sometime, saying that he's going to try to hold out. He also says that he always wondered what was in all of those empty heads back there. Well, curiosity killed the cat. Phone Guy is attacked and presumably killed by Golden Freddy, although an animatronic assumed to be Foxy can be heard banging on the door, as well as an animatronic groaning presumed to be either Bonnie or Chica. Like the second game, the player is fired at the end of the week, and it's not specified how long the restaurant stayed open after or when it was officially shut down. Again, people theorize that Mike Schmidt is really Michael Afton, which would explain the comments on his odor and why he sees Golden Freddy, who is assumed to be the ghost of his late brother. If Mike Schmidt isn't Michael Afton, another narrative is that the meaning behind the odor comment on the notice of termination is to show us that Fazbear Entertainment was looking for any reason to let the player go. If this is the case, it further characterizes the company as cold and delusional. So what did we learn from this? Well, a lot of what I've gone over is pretty widely understood, with the exception of some of my own deviant theories and explanations for ambiguous details. But I've come up with a retrospective thought. Did Fazbear Entertainment really create the monster or monsters of this franchise? Of course, most people would consider William Afton to be the biggest antagonist of of the series. But after going over the company's history, was he anything more than an unfortunate pawn in the wake of its destruction? We know from the novel trilogy that William was already extremely jealous of Henry, but the games show us that William's son was most likely the first death in the story. There was more involved than just the company. Of course, Henry's animatronics and William's older son had parts in it, but what about the company constantly making light of these events and doing whatever it takes to move forward, no matter what or who they left behind? I also have to believe that Henry was manipulated and used by the company. A lot of what is attributable to him in the games seems uncharacteristic to him. From what we know about him from the games and books, I find it hard to believe that Henry was okay with his employees frequently endangering themselves by using his temperamental springlock suits. For context, in the Silver Eyes, the springlocks that were actually used at one point had a clear button to control the springlock's retention. In the games, we arguably hear of a safer method, with a separate crank needed in order to release the springlocks, but on top of that, we learn that breathing on them can cause them to release. So was Henry really supportive of these devices being used regularly? I have to think that the larger company was looking to capitalize on his early invention, throwing caution to the wind to turn a profit. I'm not arguing that William was innocent or that Henry never made a mistake, but rather that the company is often overlooked when it comes to assigning blame. Interestingly, the slogan that Fazbear Entertainment uses seems to fit far better when describing William and Henry's dream before it was franchised: committed to family fun and above all, safety. Thanks for watching.